You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 24th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 1 a.m. in Shanghai, 2000 in Chernobyl, 1800 here in London and 1300 in New York City. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. China's central bank attempts to rouse China's economy. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer addresses the Labour Party faithful but has the nation already tuned out. And why does anyone care what you call a chocolate bar? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Patricia Cohen and Michael Peel will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from the Ukrainian historian and author Serhiy Plokhy about his new book chronicling the period in early 2022 when Russia seemed bent on contriving a second Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Patricia Cohen, global economics correspondent at the New York Times, and Michael Peel, science editor at the Financial Times and author of What Everyone Knows About Britain, except, in parentheses, the British. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Michael, we will continue as we have begun there, i.e. with absolutely crashing plugging of your relatively recent new work. You have recently been doing exactly this at a book festival not far from here.
That's right, and thank you very much for the shameless plugging. I was at the Chiswick Book Festival a couple of weekends ago, which was great fun, and was appearing with the author and science historian Subhadra Das, who's written a very good book called Uncivilized about the West and the world, and there's lots of really interesting stuff about the history of science and the politics of that. So yeah, it was great fun, lots of great questions from the audience, and yeah, these events are really, really energizing, and of course they make you think about new things about your book that you never even thought about yourself when you were writing them.
They are really good fun, except when you find yourself sitting next to, at the autograph table, to actually popular authors, and there's a huge queue for both of them, and all you've got is a pile of books, and in my personal experience, your parents tapping their watches and saying they were getting hungry. But I no word of a lie. Are you getting, though, any pushback yet from your book from people who dislike any idea that the United Kingdom has been at any period in its history other than virtuous?
Yeah, here and there, from some of the sort of usual suspects, and one or two sort of disobliging sort of reviews about, oh well, this is another sort of tract of woe about how terrible Britain is, which in fact I disagree with. It isn't about that at all.
I mean, speaking as an Australian, I didn't think there was nearly enough of that kind of thing.
Well, indeed. So it's all a question of perspective. But it's an optimistic book at its heart, and it's about how things can be better.
Patricia, on the subject of things which are not getting better, the weather and the light available in the evenings in this ridiculous country, which won't do the sensible thing and just move its clocks forward 2 hours and leave them there. You've been trying to make the most of it.
I have been. I've been doing a daily bike ride around Regent's Park, which is near where I live.
And which is lovely.
It is lovely. Although I have to say, I before this lived in New York, and the loop in Central Park is about 6 miles, and Regent's Park is about 2.7. So I feel like I have to go twice as many times around in order to, achieve the same results. And that can be discouraging sometimes, particularly because you have all of these incredibly, almost, I don't know if they're professional, but they seem professional cyclists who are whizzing around as I'm kind of slowly trudging at my pace.
I suspect they're not professional cyclists. I suspect they might just be 50-year-old men who have the outfit.
There's a lot of outfits, yes.
Well, we will be starting with China, the central bank of which has applied the defibrillators to the country's recently flatlining economy. People's Bank of China Governor Pan Gongsheng has unveiled a bunch of measures which basically amount to lowering the costs of borrowing and making it easier for banks to lend. By way of perking up a moribund housing market, interest rates on existing mortgages will be docked and minimum deposits for home buyers reduced. Whatever effect this may end up having on China's economy, it has bucked up the stock markets of the region's capitalist running dogs. Patricia, basically, is this going to work?
Well, China is in a difficult spot now. I mean, they had this enormous collapse of the housing market, and they now have essentially, units that are pre-sold but not finished, and there's no money to finish them. And even though interest rates are going down very low, there is still such a lack of confidence and so much worry about declining incomes that I think people are going to be very reluctant to take out a mortgage and start, trying to buy a house at this time. I mean, one of the issues that is, you talk to Western economists and they're applying a very Western perspective, which is consumption is what drives economy. Certainly in the U.S., consumption is almost 3/4 of what drives the gross domestic product. China is very, very different. They have always prioritized investment, building things over consumption. And, because of the state-run system, have kept incomes low. And so, the Western economists say, well, you got to give people more money so that they can buy more. But that is at odds with the Chinese government's approach.
I mean, Michael, there's a number of curiosities here. One of which strikes me as curious, at least, is how has China, of all places, ended up with a vast oversupply of housing?
Well, I mean, I think it's got a lot to do with what Patricia was talking about there, which is, this drive for investment, more and more building, and at some point it's too much building, and that's kind of where they've got to in a way, and you then have the question of what do you do about that oversupply, and there doesn't seem to be an easy answer. That this has now been bubbling along for some years. Obviously the sector is not very transparent in important ways, and the outcome is still, it's not clear how serious that's going to be in the long run.
I mean, the other problem I was going to say is that there's overcapacity in many sectors, and so housing, obviously, you can't export that abroad.
Not without extreme difficulties.
Without extreme difficulties, that's right. Unless maybe a birdhouse. But in other industries as well, whether it's cars or steels, there's also overcapacity. And so China's strategy has been to export that, which, of course, is causing rising tensions with the United States, the EU, and the rest of the world saying, hey, you're dumping your products on us. And that's why you're getting all this discussion of tariffs.
But Patricia, the measures that have been introduced in particular, and I will preface this question with an acknowledgement that, as my accountant will wearily attest, I understand absolutely nothing about economics, finance and related disciplines. Reducing interest rates on mortgages, reducing deposits for home buyers, making it easier for banks to lend, etc. Is this not a recipe for inflation and or another housing bubble? Well,
actually, what some people worry about is that you end up with deflation.
So I'm not even on the dartboard.
Not in this case. I mean, if you did all of those things at a time when the economy was running at overcapacity and, really hot, then that is what causes inflation because you have a lot more demand than you have supply. Now, this is what China, the fear is that what's happened in Japan for many years, which was even though interest rates were below zero, but they still could not get people to spend. And so that's a kind of cycle in the other way where you go down instead of prices going up.
I mean, Michael, it's obviously not the case, for all that China still does style itself a communist people's republic. It's obviously not the case anymore that this is an old school command economy. But is there something inherent about that system that does act as kind of a damper on innovation and enterprise past a certain point. Obviously, China has had astonishing economic success over the last 30 or 40 years especially.
Well, I think if you look at the scene in science, for example, I mean, there's a lot of really cutting-edge science being done in China in both sort of raw, basic research and indeed improving technologies in practical areas like electric vehicles. And I think, one shouldn't I'm not a China expert, but from my observation, one shouldn't underestimate the degree of pragmatism there is. And COVID is a good example, that it had these really, really strict rules, lockdowns, then suddenly, reopen. And, the decision when it came was immediate and radical. And so, the state can turn on a dime on some quite important aspects of policy. We've seen that in the past. And that streak of pragmatism seems to be, extremely important in thinking about this.
Just finally on this one, Patricia, because it does pivot us nicely into the topic we're about to address. What is the United States' attitude to a Chinese economic difficulty, somewhere between being really pleased that its great rival is struggling economically and really concerned that its great economic partner is struggling economically? Because this was not ever a dilemma the United States faced during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, because the US didn't buy anything from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union didn't build anything anybody else wanted.
Well, and it's not only the United States. China has been an incredible engine of global growth over the last couple of decades. So when China's economy goes down, that has a domino effect, particularly on Southeast Asia, but around the world, because it is such an important player in the supply chain. What the U.S. Treasury Secretary has been saying goes back to a little bit in terms of what's the medicine in there, and they're saying, China, you need to increase consumption, increase incomes, shift spending from the investment more to payments to the people so they can buy more. And that goes hand in hand, which is exactly what worries the U.S. the most, is that China, because it has this excess capacity that its own population isn't buying, that they're then trying to export it to the U.S. So now that's why we have all this talk about tariffs to keep out this Chinese products. So they're saying, buy home, just like buy America, buy Chinese.
Well, sticking after a fashion with economic travails besetting China, a side event on the margins of the ongoing UN General Assembly in New York City is setting forth ideas for preventing the People's Republic from cornering the market on critical minerals, those substances without which substantial sectors of what we think of as modern life would grind to a halt. The rivetingly named Minerals Security Partnership brings together 14 countries and the European Commission, and in the name of establishing a new joint finance network is rattling the tin at such corporate behemoths as Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Rio Tinto and BlackRock. Michael, how big a development potentially is this if the Minerals Security Partnership, which was established, I think, a couple of years ago, can bring these enormous financial outfits on board?
So this is another step in a process that Western policymakers have been fretting about for some years now. And it is, as you say, the fact that there are these critical minerals that a lot of them are connected to the green economy. Mm-hmm. For example, lithium used in electric vehicle batteries, or other more obscure elements that are used in wind turbines or magnets that are part of sustainable energy technologies. And the point is that the Western policymakers have kind of woken up to this quite late. So there's a lot of scrambling to try to get the investment necessary. And there are two challenges here. One is to restore or build new capacity in either Western countries themselves or in allied countries, which is a challenge in itself. And then there's also the environmental angle that metals mining is a dirty business, and that this is something that can come up against regulations in Western countries. And one really interesting example example, which sort of is emblematic of this, is there's a mine in the US, in California, called the Mountain Pass mine, which used to be a massive producer of rare earths and supplied rare earths for color TVs in the 60s and 70s. But over time, the demand fell and it became moribund. China took over the market. Now there's a move to revive the production of that mine to become a challenger to China once again. And then that one mine, you've got a kind of microcosm of the bigger story.
Patricia, there has been, I regret to inform, an unimpressed editorial in the Global Times, which is usually a reasonable enough reflection of what the Chinese Communist Party is actually thinking. And it says, and I'm certainly not going to attempt to do the accent, I'm not really sure I can give this the requisite undertone of harumph, but I will try. It says, while the US has rallied its allies to form a so-called mineral security alliance, I do like a good so-called, under the banner of breaking China's grip on supplies of critical minerals, in sarcastic inverted commas, this initiative does little to mask its own ambitions and strategic maneuvers aimed at establishing a global monopoly in key mineral sectors. I mean, in fairness, they're probably not wrong, are they?
Well, I think the idea that they could even approach a global monopoly is laughable. And in fact, who has the global monopoly is China. China produces 60% of the critical minerals in the global supply mining. More importantly, though, it has 90% of the processing facilities in the world. So that's kind of as close as you can get to a global monopoly, and a lot of the rest is in Indonesia, some in Russia. So, is this an important security question? Absolutely. I mean, both strategically and economically, because it goes to the whole issue of these minerals are so important in, everything that we use, electronics and cars and, everything that you can think of, that if China did want to cut off supply, that would be a serious security problem, not to mention, causing economic collapse in a lot of industries around the world. But there's also the issue, which Michael got to before, is that one of the reasons China was able to progress so far ahead of everyone else was because they paid little attention to some of the environmental effects. So now going back, that's the question of how to kind of regain this lost ground, and it will be tough. I mean, I think they'll definitely do it, but I think it'll be tough.
Michael, Patricia uses the phrase regaining lost ground. You were talking earlier about Western policymakers playing catch up, which right there is pretty much the story of our times. The potential concerns, environmental, strategic, economic, whatever, around China having such a huge chunk of the market in these minerals, that does really seem like something somebody should have seen coming, doesn't it?
Well, I think so, and I mean it's part of a bigger story, isn't it? About the belief, some time after the fall of the Berlin Wall that China was going to evolve in a way in which increased wealth brought a tendency to go to a more Western style, sort of democratic or at least semi-democratic system. Of course, it hasn't turned out that way, and that is a sort of fundamental miscalculation which kind of overarches all of these individual stories, like the ones we're talking about in metals. And
just finally on this one, Patricia, do we have to hope at some level that China does care about the environment and the climate at least as much as anyone else? Because they won't escape the consequences of this. And indeed, certainly given the air pollution in some Chinese cities, it's arguable that they are actually bearing the brunt of it.
I mean, first of all, absolutely, it's essential. China is so huge, but the irony, of course, is that China is ahead in many ways in green technology. I mean, that's the whole point about why the EU and the US want to keep out EV vehicles, because they're very good and they're very cheap from China, and they've really mastered the technology. And they have that in a lot of other green technology as well. So in many ways, even though perhaps it was driven more by economic concerns than climate concerns, there are a lot of ways in which China is ahead of the West actually in the transition to a green economy.
Well, here in the United Kingdom, it is very much party conference season. Labour are currently conducting theirs in Liverpool, their first such wingding since being returned to power earlier this year after a lengthy stretch in the wilderness. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, who led Labour to its landslide victory, has not enjoyed much in the way of a honeymoon. His personal approval rating has slumped some 45% since taking office, possibly a reflection on how many voters are not convinced that someone clearing 160 grand a year cannot buy his own damn suits. Starmer nevertheless gestured. Why did I say gestured? It's gestured. There's too many ways to say G. That's something I'm going to get to grips with tomorrow. Starmer nevertheless gestured vaguely towards a light at the end of the tunnel. Here is some of what the Prime Minister had to say.
People said we wouldn't win across Britain, but we did. People say we can't deliver national renewal, but we can and we will. We will stabilise our economy, clear out the Tory rot, fix the foundation and deliver the mandate of change. A Britain built to last, built with respect, built with pride, because together we have shown that Britain belongs to you.
Michael, I am delighted to be able to report that insane people on the internet, some of them with extremely large followings, are perceiving sinister undertones in that climactic phrase, Britain belongs to you, as far as I can tell, because the word belongs is uttered in Cabaret, the film, by Nazis.
Yeah,
God bless the British left, never change.
Yeah, that sounds like a bit of a stretch.
I would think, yes, the kind of reach that could lead someone to putting their back out. That aside, what did you make of Starmer's speech?
Well, I think in some ways it's highlighted where we are in the situation we describe. I mean, first of all, the kind of the discontent you talk about, I mean, it's not unprecedented. I mean, both the Thatcher and Cameron governments were really quite unpopular in their early days, for example, and also it's become a cliche, but the Labour landslide was a loveless landslide in the sense that it scored less than 35% of the vote.
It was voting the Tories out rather than voting Labour in.
Exactly. Having said that, I think that people will still, after that speech, have, and the speech by Rachel Reeves yesterday, the Chancellor, have some of the same questions which are kind of structural questions about, is Labour really getting to grips with some of the big challenges that face the country, but which are not fully discussed. And one of those is investment. Where is the money going to come from? I mean, Rachel Reeves has signalled that she's going to maybe change the fiscal rules to allow more money to be available for investment. But still, in terms of revenue raising, Labour has really tied its hands by saying the main tax rates that raise most of the money are going to stay the same. So there's still a question of how is it going to mobilise the kind of resources for the renewal that Starmer and Reeves talk about. And the other point that's not really addressed is demographics. I mean, Starmer, talked about immigration being too high today. Well, you can debate the morality of Labour's position, but there's also a very practical point that, this country, like many other Western countries, the population is aging rapidly, and, there are multiple ways how you can approach that. One of them is to have more immigration to serve the services for the aging population. There are other ways, but if you want to restructure your economy in a way that takes account of that aging population, then you have to tell people how you're going to do that. And at the moment, Labour hasn't really signalled how it's going to deal with that major demographic shift, which is not unique to the UK by any means, but it's obviously a big challenge that's going to be at the heart of a lot of economic policy making.
Patricia, he did rather cane the immigration motif, but he did it in, I guess, an interesting rhetorical fashion. He attempted to reappropriate the Brexit slogan, "Take Back Control." He said that this was a Labour argument, comparing and contrasting Labour with the sort of, free-for-all libertarianism of conservatism, making the point that the party, the previous government, who'd obviously kept promised time and time again that they would reduce immigration, just kept letting it increase. It's understandable enough why he's doing that. He doesn't want to lose those Labour turned Tory turned Labour again voters that got him elected, but he needs to back that up, doesn't he?
Well, I mean, the immigration issue is just so kind of confounding in as Michael was saying, not only in the UK but in Europe as well. One of the reasons that immigration has increased so much in Britain was because of policies that were supported not only by the government but by a large portion of the population. It was the influx of refugees from Ukraine, which people were taking into their homes, very at the beginning of the war. Secondly, this issue, it's not only aging, but the NHS really could not operate without immigrants.
Indeed not.
So they're kind of in this bind between you have this very political reaction against immigrants, and there's obviously a racial and cultural element to that. It all depends where immigrants come from. At the same time, this economic need.
He's still trying to position himself, Michael, as, basically Mr. Dull but efficient. He sort of talked about his opponents. He said, you may call it populism, but I prefer to call it the politics of easy answers because at its core, that's what it is, a deliberate refusal to countenance tough decisions because the political pain is just too much. This is the tunnel part of his argument. Do you think he stressed enough the light?
Well, that's a matter of taste. I mean, I think, there's definitely a sense, in what we've seen from Starmer and Reeves in particular, that they're picking up on this idea that they've overdone the gloom, and every politician has to, offer some optimism, right? And I think, there've been sort of strange sort of comments from, for example, advisors to an advisor to Reeves, sort of quoted anonymously saying, well, this government was elected, for fiscal rectitude and so on and so on. But that wasn't the spirit of the election, I don't think, as far as many people saw it. It was about, the mood is about the decline of public services and maybe the decline of the country more widely and how that needs fixing. So it needs more than sort of managerial technocracy. And I think that, the other thing that's interesting is that although Starmer has presented himself as a figure of managerial competence and probity, the way he started has not necessarily generated stories that have supported that. Both the rows within Downing Street, within the operation itself, again, a lot of people think that he needs to get a grip on that, as a manager, and you can't have aides at war and sort of arguing over who's paid more than who and why. And the other thing, the probity argument, and there's an interesting point I think here about the limits of saying you're a stickler for the rules. That a point that Starmer and other ministers have been making is, well, apart with one or two sort of exceptions, the hospitality, the other gifts of clothing and other things were all declared, and that was in accordance with the rules. But, of course, that can be true, but still it seems off to many people when the government's message is about how difficult things are and how everyone's going to have to pay more in some way to help improve the country. And so it's really an argument of, well, just because you can do something, it doesn't necessarily mean you should. And I'm not sure that the government has really kind of shown that it understands that. We've seen a little bit of backpedaling now, saying they won't take more donations of clothes from donors, but there's probably still a way to go on how they deal with that question.
Well, staying in the UK, listeners with long memories for inane culture war brouhahas or brouhaha, whichever is correct, may recall the uproar which greeted, circa 1990, the decision to rename the Marathon Bar, a frankly unpleasant confection of chocolate, nougat, peanuts and caramel, the Snickers. Listeners who have spent 34 years seething at this sacrilege may now rejoice in the news that Mars, manufacturer of the off-puttingly chewy treat, will make available a special Marathon Retro Edition, possibly with an eye to the Christmas stockings of the kind of mad uncle who is really looking forward to seeing Oasis next summer. Patricia, do you have any views on the bar itself, the former Marathon, now Snickers, shortly to become, in a limited edition, the Marathon again?
Well, I have to say, out of all of the questions that you've posed in any time I've been on this show, whether it's Chinese economic policy or critical minerals for the green transition, this is a subject it's very difficult as an American to speak about because we never had marathon bars. They were always named Snickers since 1930.
That is true.
And a story that I read, I have no idea if this is true.
Did you read it on the internet?
I read it on the internet.
It must be true.
It must be true, yes. So it said that when they, in introducing the candy bar Snickers here, that it sounded too close to Knickers, and they thought people would make fun of it, and so that's why they changed the name to Marathon.
They thought the English of all people would make puerile fun of a name which sounded a bit like a somewhat naughty word.
Heaven forbid.
So not only did I never even hear of a Marathon bar until today, but I actually was never a fan of Snickers bars.
No, they're horrible.
Mine was a $100,000 bar. Maybe it's $1 million bar now, but when I was a kid, it was a $100,000 bar.
To the best of my recollection, it was always known as the Snickers in Australia, where I grew up, and I have to say I never much cared for them, largely because, Michael, we have in Australia, as you do not have here, both the Violet Crumble and the Cherry Ripe, which are vastly superior, not merely to the Snickers, but to any other chocolate bar in all of creation. But, Michael, why do people get wound up about this stuff? I mean, I suspect it's one of those things where really almost nobody actually cares, but the very small number of quite weird people who do decide to make a massive thing of it.
Yeah, I think so, and glad you got your cards on the table about the quality of as you perceive it, of marathon stroke Snickers.
Yeah, I'm not getting a box of free marathons off the back of this show.
That's for sure. But yeah, look, it's part of a sort of bigger culture of nostalgia, right? That which I think sort of psychologically one can explain that the nostalgia industry, whether it's in music or food or books or whatever, or films, it's not necessarily about the quality of the product. It's just that the person who remembers it was young at the time they enjoyed it.
It's exactly that. It's the human condition, isn't it?
Yeah.
We get to somewhere probably in our mid to late 20s and just want nothing to change ever again.
Well, actually, when I just thought of something as we were talking before about the aging population. I mean, clearly the real reason is because it gets bars, the company that makes the bars, a lot of free publicity and people talking about it, which is exactly what every manufacturer wants. Coke put out its old the bottles that they had from the 1930s, which was again not even changing the thing, just the package it's in, but. I'm wondering if nostalgia in advertising is getting bigger now because of the aging population.
Yeah.
So, producers really were always endlessly in search of the young consumer. I mean, we know that's certainly very true with media, with TV and movies. It always wants, even newspapers always wanted to reduce their demos, get younger readers, younger people. But the reality is that the bulk now of consumers are getting older. And so nostalgia, actually, you're hitting a lot more consumers than you used to be because you're targeting a different audience.
It's a growing market.
Well, on that depressing thought, Patricia Cohen and Michael Peel, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, for a few weeks in early 2022, it looked grimly possible that the Ukrainian town of Chernobyl would become synonymous with nuclear disaster for the second time. In the early stages of Russia's full-scale invasion, Russian troops seized the decommissioned nuclear power station near Chernobyl, reactor number 4 of which underwent a calamitous meltdown back in 1986. The Russians also took hostage the Ukrainian staff still monitoring the plant, who responded with considerable courage and ingenuity. The test of nerves between the captured and their captors is described in a new book, Chernobyl Roulette, by Ukrainian historian Serhiy Plokhy, previously author of Chernobyl, History of a Tragedy, about the events of 1986. I spoke to Serhiy at Midori House earlier and began by asking when he realised he'd have to write another Chernobyl book.
It came quite late. The big war started in February of 2022. I was on that day in the building of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I was working in their archives, researching a book on the international impact of Chernobyl, the original Chernobyl, 1986. And I left the building because I didn't think that what I was doing was important anymore. I focused on something else. There was a different book, a different project that came out of that. And then at the end of 2022, I looked back and I realized that there was really untold story about Chernobyl too, and that I'm quite uniquely qualified to write on that particular subject. And then the only question that I had was whether, as a historian, I would be able to collect enough sources, enough material, whether there is enough to write a book. And I wasn't sure for some period of time. And then I really got lucky. I got in touch with some wonderful journalists organized in the project that is called Reckoning Project, that were collecting interviews on the war and including on the occupation of Chernobyl. They moved into the area after the Ukrainian army retook the region. And they were kind enough to allow me to work with those materials. So that's how a book came into existence.
It's an extraordinary story at a number of levels. There's obviously the drama attached to a military conflict involving it's no longer an active nuclear plant, but it's still obviously an extremely volatile site. But it also becomes this extraordinary study of human psychology, because it becomes... The Russians obviously arrive assuming themselves to be conquerors, but they realize quite quickly, although I think the Ukrainian staff might have realized at first, that the Russians have kind of made themselves prisoners.
Yes, it's absolutely a unique story. I call it really kidnapping the kidnappers. Because the Russians came and took over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They were well trained. They knew the layout. They really exercised to do that at the Kursk nuclear power plant, which is today in the news. So they knew how to take it over. They didn't know how to keep it. Because even when they brought from Russia experts, what Chernobyl zone became in the last 30 plus years, it's really a unique site in terms of the processes that happen in there underneath the reactor number 4, with the big part of the original Chernobyl nuclear waste is still being there. The way how it is monitored, the new technology, Russians didn't know what to do with that. And Ukrainians had that stamina, first of all, and then they had this knowledge that Russians didn't have. And they turned this knowledge into really a power. The power relations, to a degree, changed at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, where Russians were in control of the site altogether, but it was the Ukrainian management that had the right to issue permits to visit the most dangerous places in this now quite big complex, industrial and scientific complex that is called Chernobyl nuclear power plant.
I mean, there's a lot going on in this story which does seem a microcosm for a lot of the factors in play in the conflict at large, one of which is an apparent more or less complete disregard by Russian officers and Russia generally of the lives of its own people, including this section which I don't think nobody would dare make up, that the Russians are actually ordered to go and dig trenches in what is known as the Red Forest, which for listeners unfamiliar with Chernobyl, and I'm lucky enough to have been to the exclusion zone many years ago, and I was told, for the love of God, don't touch anything organic, don't disturb any soil, etc., etc. But the Red Forest is one of the most poisoned parts of the exclusion zone, and therefore one of the most toxic places on Earth, and they just went and dug it up?
That's exactly what happened. And when I was researching and then describing that story in my book, I put somewhere, it's like they never watched HBO miniseries. And my editor crossed it out and said, "That's not how you write. This doesn't work well with the rest of the book." So I had to find a way to say that in a different way. But one thing that really surprised me was that how little changed between 1986 and 2022 in what once was the Soviet mentality and attitude toward your own people, recklessness, the disregard for life and health of your own people that certainly the Chernobyl 86 demonstrated, the clean-up work, the military that was sent there, they were called biorobots. Mm-hmm. And 2022, the same story, a different generation of biorobots, again sent by Moscow through the most dangerous place on Earth, or at least in radioactive terms, the most dangerous place on Earth, to cross corners to get faster to Kiev. So that was one shocking experience. Another one was how much really the Ukrainians changed the Ukrainian society, which were part of the 1986 story. Mm. And now you look at the people at the plant who were left without really any connection with Kiev or meaningful connection that they still can communicate, but there is no clear instructions are coming from nowhere, from Vienna, where the International Atomic Energy Agency is as well, because everyone is unprepared. It's uncharted waters. They're making decisions on their own. What is loyalty, what is betrayal? They decide that actually they can't leave the plant because there will be another disaster. Mm. Not leaving the plant, they're becoming really collaborators. Right? Mm. So there's so many gray zones there. They have to make their decisions, and they make their decisions as citizens. They stick to their instructions. They stick to what they consider to be right or wrong. It's not a top-down anymore system of how the system functions, like it functioned in the Soviet Union, like it functions in Russia today. And I really discovered it is a microcosm of many things, but also this is an encounter of now two very different societies, despite the fact that back in 86, they were part of the same system and to a degree the same part of the culture, safety culture, political culture, and so on and so forth.
That was Serhiy Plokhy. His new book is Chernobyl Roulette. It's out now and very much recommended, much like all his others. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to our panellists today, Patricia Cohen and Michael Peel. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.